Hey guys, so in our last video for Unit 9, we discussed the differences between civil liberties and civil rights and how our US Constitution and Bill of Rights actually protect our liberties and rights. So today we are going to be talking about a process that is about the Bill of Rights and these liberties, but that is called the doctrine of selective incorporation. So we're going to be taking a look at this doctrine as well as the 14th Amendment. And through these notes and the activity that is in Google Classroom, your learning targets are to define and summarize this process of selective incorporation, to explain the implications of this doctrine of selective incorporation, and to discuss this doctrine in the context of federalism. So how did this alter the federalism or federalist component of our country today? So, as always, just some context. The Bill of Rights, which we talked about in the last video, if you remember, was designed to protect the people from the federal government. Remember, the anti-feds were fearful of a strong national government, so they put this in place to actually protect that federal government from infringing on your rights unnecessarily. And in fact, the Bill of Rights, if you take a look, which you should have already, says Congress shall make no law, right? It doesn't say state governments, it says Congress, which is the federal government. And even in the very beginning years of our country, the Supreme Court even ruled that the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. And this is later going to be overturned, but the fundamental thing to keep note of here is that before this doctrine of selective incorporation, the Bill of Rights only protected people from the federal government, and it did not apply to the states. Now, the problem was most discrimination and abuse of civil liberties, of civil rights, took place at the state level, right? We talked about some of the benefits of federalism, how states can adapt to the needs of their state, but also you do have disparity and inequality in terms of how policies are implemented from state to state. So we saw a lot of inequality and abuse of power coming from the state governments. So the courts, starting with Gitlow v. New York, which we'll talk about in a second, decided to move toward the doctrine of selective incorporation. And this is very important, the gradual application of the Bill of Rights to the states. And this is done on a case-by-case basis. There has not been one case that has applied the entire Bill of Rights. The court has actually said, we are not going to do total incorporation. We're going to do selective. We are going to select the rights and liberties of the Bill of Rights to apply them to the states as they come up. So over a succession of rulings, the Supreme Court has established this doctrine to limit state regulation of civil rights and liberties. And they've held that many protections of the Bill of Rights apply to every level of the government, not just the federal government. So for example, of this case-by-case basis, many amendments even have been chunked up and broken down and incorporated in parts. So it took many cases to incorporate the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. And that is what is meant by selective, right? It's not the entire 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights. It's not necessarily even a whole amendment. It depends on the circumstance of the case and what the court deems necessary or fundamental to that time. Okay, so how did the courts, or how have they justified selective incorporation? And we need to talk about probably one of the most important amendments to the Constitution, which is the 14th Amendment. And this was ratified during Reconstruction. And the question became, after the Civil War, this idea of equality and protection of citizens. Would the rebel states, the Southerners that had just lost this war, deny newly freed people of color or maybe Unionists who had fought against them their basic freedoms? So we see this 14th Amendment pass that does the following 4 things. 1, it establishes citizenship. It decides or outlines that citizenship qualification. It incorporates the Bill of Rights to the states, and it contains 2 clauses. The Due Process Clause, which ultimately due process is about fairness, ensures fair procedures in the justice system, like fair trials for an accused person. prevents arbitrary government decisions to avoid mistaken or abusive or the abusive taking of life, liberty, and property. Essentially, what this means is the government at all levels must respect your legal liberties and rights. And it also has the Equal Protection Clause, which requires a standard of equal treatment by the government without discrimination, whether that's your race, your gender, sexuality, age, etc., etc. Now, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment is what's going to be used to most often justify selective incorporation. So civil liberties are really connected with due process and selective incorporation. The Equal Protection Clause is going to be more towards civil rights, which we will see in the second half of this unit. So I wanted to show you guys the text of the 14th Amendment, and on your note sheet there is a section for you to highlight the certain areas. So broken down, it says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Boom, establishes citizenship, right? If you're born here or you become naturalized, does not matter, you are a citizen. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So that actually does a couple of things here. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities, nor shall any state deprive a person. That incorporates a lot of these Bill of Rights liberties to the state governments. That's how the court's going to justify it. And then it also adds in that due process piece here. That due process of law is that due process clause. Nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And of course, that then is that equal protection clause that we said is going to be used for mostly civil rights when we talk about that in this unit. Now, the very first selective incorporation case was Gitlow v. New York in 1925. This was the first time that the court entertained the idea that rights and liberties of the Bill of Rights could be applied to the states. And what this did was incorporated freedom of speech and ultimately said that this is saying, that states are prevented from infringing on free thought and expression. And it's appropriate that the First Amendment is emphasized so early on in this process, right? Because that is the hallmark of our civil liberties, right? It's what we were fighting for from our freedom from Great Britain. It's been a concern about protecting our freedom of expression without punishment or retribution from our founding of our country. And to this day, the vast majority of the Bill of Rights has been incorporated to the states of our country, most of them coming from the Warren Court during a lot of FDR, years in president. Now, there are some rights that are not yet incorporated, just as an overview. These have been deemed not as necessarily fundamental to the workings of the entire society. We will see if these are ever incorporated. But the Third Amendment, no quartering of troops. Fifth Amendment, the grand jury indictment in misdemeanor cases. The Seventh Amendment's right to jury trials in civil cases. And the Eighth Amendment's protection against excessive bail and fines. Now, as you'll see here, specifically with the Fifth and the Eighth, those have other clauses to them that have been incorporated. Double jeopardy, self-incrimination, when we'll talk about that when we get to rights of the accused. The Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, those have been incorporated. But there are sections, because of this doctrine of selective incorporation, that have not been included. Now, we need to talk about the profound change, the shift in the balance of power when it comes to the selective incorporation doctrine and federalism. Before the process started, the federal courts honestly had very little say about the day-to-day operations of state and local governments. These state and local governments regulated speech, the press, they handled criminal investigations, they handled prosecutions and punishments. And for a time, states even had official established churches, all without interference from federal agencies or the courts. And that has long since passed. Before, right, when we look at this, all rights not given to the federal government are reserved to the states according to the 10th Amendment. And that was what the states ran with until this doctrine of selective incorporation. Right now, you have a federal amendment, which, according to the Supremacy Clause, we know trumps the state law. So you have this federal amendment 14 that is requiring states to uphold due process for all citizens, and that federal law is supreme. Now, this has implications. It has established federal guidelines for states. So, for example, incorporating clauses of the First Amendment led to federal guidelines for state and localities as to what types of expression they may allow. And we'll look at that in the next couple of lessons, like obscenity, sorts of marches, rallies, etc. It has also led to fairer criminal justice systems throughout the country and expanded uniformity from state to state. Incorporation has changed the enforcement of criminal law in states. It has made the criminal justice system fairer, right, because we are now nationalizing many of the rights of the accused, which again, we will look more in depth at later this unit. But the biggest thing to note here, guys, is that yes, this selective incorporation doctrine through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment shifted power to the federal government by limiting state regulations of civil liberties and civil rights. So your assignment for today is to use the resources that are underneath your notes on your handout to analyze how the following 3 cases impacted selective incorporation. So using those links, fill in the chart and then answer the summary question that I've given you guys. If you have any questions, I look forward to hearing from you during office hours through email or Google Meet, and I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.